We're good? Hey, and I'm up. Okay. This is like the last day of the first ever NDC in the United States, which is kind of exciting. All right, so best thing, I'm going to ask like 2 or 3 people just to kind of get people engaged because I like to ask questions. So best thing you've seen so far? Give me 2 people, 3 people, the best talk you've seen. Anyway, I'm going to point. What's the best talk you've seen so far, Heather? Oh, that's cool. Yeah. That's awesome. All right. So no one else wants to share a talk. That's all right. Here's the thing: is this is obviously not a technical talk, right? So I appreciate so many people coming and it's something that is not exactly directly about tech. Right, but this is something that's really important to what all of us do in our everyday lives, and a lot of times it's something we don't think about very often. So quick introduction. My name's Jeff Strauss. This is what you need to know about open source. Trust me, I'm a lawyer. And a little bit about me. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri. I'm a consultant with a company called Asynchrony Labs, which is part of Worldwide Technology. I run an event called the Kansas City Developer Conference in July. So if you just love what you've done here and you've loved kind of seeing NDC, we have a similar style polyglot event down there. So feel free to come and join us in Kansas City. Not too far of a drive or a short flight. And also, as has been said, I'm a lawyer. I'm sorry. Like really, I am. Here's the thing: is I sat for the bar in Missouri in 2004. I do not practice. I haven't practiced in many years. I'm a software consultant. I solve business problems with software, which is very similar to solving business problems with the law. Different tools, same concepts. But this is something that I've always been very passionate about. Now, I'm a lawyer. This is important. I'm not your lawyer. Okay? I am not your lawyer. What I mean is we're going to talk about some broad principles of law, broad principles about contracts, about licenses, what they mean, what it means to be open source. Understand that your lawyer is your friend. I say I'm sorry because I don't really even like lawyers, despite being one, but you should love your lawyer. But your lawyer is important, right? Because your lawyer, your company's lawyer, your team's lawyer, they know you. They know your situation. They know the details of the things that matter in your business, in your world. I can't know those things. So understand we're talking about broad principles so that you know what you need to discuss with your legal team, with your business people when you get back when you get back to your jobs. Okay? Not your lawyer. Plus, I don't want to get disbarred, right? So not your lawyer. Cool. Why does this matter? Oh, yeah. No, I am not your lawyer. Thank you for asking. I am not your lawyer. Why does this matter to people? Like, why are you here? Why do you choose? There's all these great technical talks. Why does this topic matter? Anyone? I'm going to make people talk. I'm going to point. I'm going to like point to John because I know you. Why does this matter? Why is this topic? Why does it matter? Because we use it every day. Because we use it every day and we almost never think about it. Right? And there was a world many moons ago when businesses have very strong feelings about open source, right? Where a lot of corporate type places would say we don't use open source software because of all of the risks, right? So if such things are a thing. But that's not possible today, right? It's very hard to effectively write software today without using open source. So this affects what we do. And open source software, when we talk about licenses, these are contracts. These are things, they aren't just like check the box, right? And say, I agree to the terms. When you check that box, you download that package, it does mean something. You are agreeing to things when you use open source packages, and you have to be aware of what you're agreeing to do. Right? So I like to start with a few definitions. Get everybody on the same page, because I think a lot of people think they know a lot about this topic. And a lot of people know some. Right? But there are very kind of broad things I want to get us all on the same page so we're all thinking about the same sort of idea. So for starters, what is OSS? Like, what does it even mean to be open source software? And I know I have a lot of questions. I said I like to ask questions. Here's the thing. Like, here's why I do this. You go to law school, right? And law school uses the Socratic method. Right? So like the professor walks back and forth, and he talks about some broad principle of law, and he asks a question, he turns, right? And then he just turns and points and asks a question, and the student's like, oh, I don't know why you're looking at me, but it gets people engaged, right? So so I don't have to point and ask, someone tell me what it means to be open source software. It's okay if it's wrong, Got a point. I'm going to point at you. Freely, well, that's good. Freely distributable. Anything else? All right. Source code is available. It's like, these are good. That's good. See, a lot of times I kind of hear things like, I'll hear the source code thing, right? Or I'll hear it's free, right? So open source software is a very specific thing. Like it means something specific, right? And the idea of open source is maybe a newer concept than the idea of free software, or like the Free Software Foundation, right? The open source definition is a somewhat, in the grand scheme of things, newer concept, 20, 25 years or so going back in the software industry. And what it basically means is that open source software is software that is distributed under an actual open source license. And to be an open source license means the terms of the license have certain features of them. Most importantly of which, there are others, but most importantly are these 5 things. Free redistribution, source code inclusion, right? Derived works, non-interference, and non-discrimination. These 5 things are central to what it means to be an open source license, which means you have open source software. We're going to talk about each of these things in turn because they don't necessarily always mean exactly what they sound like, right? So, free redistribution. Right? What does that really mean? It doesn't necessarily mean like, oh, it's free. It's free software. It's free. It is free software. It is free. But when we talk about free software, we mean like free as in free speech, not free as in free beer, right? We mean freedom of information, sharing and distributing of information. The idea behind this actually goes back before open source. It goes back to a time of like Richard Stallman, a lot of people who are pioneers in the sort of the Free Software Foundation, the idea of free software. The concept was that if you are executing software in your environment, you should have the right to fully understand and know what that thing is that you are executing in your environment. In order to have that, you need to be able to see the source code, you need to be able to have access to it, you need to be able to freely redistribute it and share it among the people who are consuming it. Right? That's largely the idea that underlies all of these things. And remember that, right? Because when we talk about what it is to be free speech, it's all about that. It's not free speech, open source software. It's about that idea of freedom of knowing what it is that you're executing in your environment or in your consumer's environment. That's what makes it free. And you can freely redistribute it. So I obtain a package, and it's under an open source license. I can freely redistribute that thing to whomever else I please, sometimes under certain terms and conditions. Source code inclusion, I think, is kind of the most obvious one, right? The source code's available, right? But it has to be like the source code is available. It doesn't mean that it gets shipped anymore necessarily. There was a time when that was more the case, right? There was a time when software was being shipped on, disks and CD-ROMs and things. Like now we don't do that very often, right? Most software is made available digitally. So very frequently, it doesn't mean the source code has to be included with the distribution. It means the source code is readily available for little or nominal cost to obtain that covers the software that you've obtained, right? So it doesn't necessarily always mean it's packaged. These days, a lot of times, right, it's like in GitHub or something, you can go see the source code. But in one, it doesn't have to be, right? It doesn't have to be in GitHub to be open source software. There has to be a way for you to contact the distributor of the software and obtain the source code. And it has to be actual source code, not compiled code, not, sort of assembler code, not obfuscated code. The actual original source code as it is built, right? It has to be source code that you could take and theoretically recompile, rebuild yourself without having to decompile or unuglify anything. Okay? Derived works. Derived works is interesting because this is also, I feel like, kind of at the core of what open source is about, right? The idea that not only can we take this thing and redistribute it, but we can actually make derivative works from it. So this is really 2 things in one. Derived works means, first of all, you have the right to modify. So not only do I have the right to download and see the source code, I can do as I please with it. I can make modifications to it. I can take pieces, I can hack it apart, I can fix bugs, I can add new features. I can do what I want to modify the original source code I obtain. And I have the right to redistribute that same thing that I've just made. So I took the original package. Yes, I can freely redistribute that, but I can also modify it to my liking and distribute the thing that I made from it. Now, this is a funny word, right? Because redistribute, what does that even mean? what does it really mean to distribute software? Because again, there was a time when distributing software likely meant shipping out a whole bunch of disks or CD-ROMs or whatever, or shipping stuff out on servers. And now that's not always the case, right? What about when we have, like you have software that you're distributing to everyone all over the world? Think about like the SaaS world. If we have software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, there's everything as a service now, right? Like I worked on a project a couple years ago that worked heavily with MATLAB, like MathWorks up in Boston. They had like a MATLAB production server. It was they dubbed it math as a service, right? Like everything's as a service now. Well, am I distributing software? Right. If I'm hosting something, it's a web application, and it's executing in my environment, right? What makes free software free? Why do we care? Because if I have code that's executing in my environment, I have the right to understand and appreciate what it is that's being executed in my environment. If what you're doing is making a remote call, HTTP, whatever, up to some server, and I'm executing it in my environment and sending you the results, have I distributed? It was an open question for a long time, right? But the answer, largely, under most licenses, is no. Right? Under most licenses, if I have something running on a server and you're only accessing it remotely, I haven't distributed anything to you. That matters because when we start talking a little bit about some of the individual licenses and what they mean, some of the restrictions or those terms and conditions, like you get license over this software if you do these things, a lot of those things are when you redistribute a derivative work. When you redistribute the software, you have to do these things. Well, you haven't necessarily redistributed if all you're doing is executing something on your own remote server. There are exceptions. There's a specific GPL license we'll talk about where that loophole is closed. But you also have to remember that you are still distributing some software, right? Like your server processes, your backend stuff, whatever you're doing up in the cloud, maybe remote, but like if it's a web application, you're still distributing, say, JavaScript and HTML. Your JavaScript is still maybe being distributed, even if your backend service processes, all that, your API is not. So you got to think about, even within the same application or same suite of applications, you have to be aware of how am I using this thing? Is this something that's going to be distributed to like to a client machine in a browser? Is it going to be sent down in an application to a phone? Or is it something that's really only going to exist on my server and execute up there? That could make a difference on the terms of the license that you're using and what software you may be able to or not be able to use for your needs. Non-interference. I don't know, this next slide, I've never been able to think of a better slide for this. So this slide is kind of, it's horrible. But the idea of non-interference is that you cannot require, under the terms of an open source license, that a piece of software can only work in a given medium, can only be distributed to execute in a given environment, operating system, for example, right? I build something as a tool, and the thing I built is built to work on Linux, and I've distributed it, and you get it, and I'm giving you a license to use this, but you can only also put it out on Linux. You can't like redistribute this or modify it in a way that works on Windows or works on Mac or works on a Raspberry Pi or what have you. That would be considered interference. You can't interfere with the rest of the environment in which person wants to operate and use the software. So you can't provide that limitation. Does that make sense? Okay. And then lastly, non-discrimination. This one's kind of fun because the actual open source definition, and there's sort of an FAQ on the open source initiative. We'll talk about them in a bit. There's kind of a question of, can I restrict the use to not be for evil, right? And the answer is no. You can't discriminate, right? You can't discriminate in any way on how someone else can use the software. So let's say that I build software, like a real world example. This is I build a component, and I'm at a bank, right? And I build financial software. And I have a component or a library I want to open source, but I want to say anyone else can use this thing, but you can't use it to build other financial software because you can't build something with my component that competes with me. That's not open source. You can't discriminate in use, right? You can't tell someone how they can or cannot use the software. Similarly, like I said, like evil, you can't even tell the end user, right? You can't tell the end user that they can't use it for an evil purpose, for a bad purpose. There is no way that you can tell an end user how they might use or consume your open source software. Now, it's important to realize that we're talking about licenses. So, like Voldemort, okay, he can use some open source, and I can't tell him he can't use it to go like kill Muggleborns. But that doesn't mean that he won't go to Azkaban. right? Like, it doesn't mean that he won't go to prison. So another important distinction is we're talking about contract law here, not criminal law, right? We're not talking about criminal law. So that doesn't mean that you won't get in trouble. It just means that the terms of the license can't prevent you from doing something. If you do something unlawful, it's still unlawful, right? What we're talking about with open source licensing is talking about intellectual property law. We're talking specifically about intellectual property law. So, right, in the United States, that really largely means copyrights, patents, trademarks. Open source licensing and open source software specifically deals with copyright. Most of the time, really all of the time, we're talking about copyrights. So I have software that code is a copyright work, and I'm saying, I wrote this thing, I own it, I'm letting you use it. But I'm letting you use, right, I'm giving you a license over my copyright, I still own it. But I'm allowing you to use, I'm giving you a non-exclusive license to use my thing when it comes to copyrighted works. Some open source licenses deal with patents. Some do not. I have an entire soapbox about software patents and how I feel about them, which we'll avoid because then we'll be here for a long, long time talking about patents. But some of the licenses talk about patents. More recent ones. We'll talk about that in a bit and what the implications there are. Really, none of them talk about trademark. Trademark is a whole different area of intellectual property, right? That's brand, that's identity, right? That's me, that's NDC, that's your company, right? It's the name, the logos, the theming, the branding that goes around the identity of the owner of a piece of software. Open source software and open source licensing has nothing to do with that. So just because I give you the right to use the software that I produced, and I give you a license over my copyrighted material and maybe over any patentable material, that doesn't mean you can assume my identity and redistribute it as though you are me. Right? There's a distinction there. Right? I'm giving you right to the work. I'm not giving you right to use my identity to promote what you're doing. Not licensing the trademarks. Don't steal people's trademarks. Right? Don't pretend to be someone else. It's strangely easy to do and happens more than you would think. And it's morally bad, but also illegal. So don't do that. Now, a couple other things. Sale. Can you sell open source software? Yeah, right? Not like free as in free beer, right? Free as in free speech. You can totally sell open source software. You can make a ton of money selling open source software. But how? How do you do that? And when I say how, that's because remember, say I have some open source software. I distribute it. I sell it to you, and you say, thank you very much. And you can turn around the next day or the next minute and give it to everyone else. Freely redistributable, right? Like you can just give it to everyone. So why is anyone going to come and buy it from me? Because everyone who, you just bought it and you're giving it out for less money or for free. And yet people do this. How does that work? How do we succeed in doing that? Any ideas how you might monetize open source, given the fact that someone else is going to turn around and just give it away for less? Thoughts? Support? Good, right? Warranties, assurance, right? A great example is, I have this slide back, right? So quick aside, only because I use these terms a fair bit, and they don't mean the same thing. We know about making money and monetizing off of open source software. We mean commercializing it. That doesn't mean making it proprietary. It doesn't mean closing it, right? Proprietary is like closed source software, right? I don't have to share the sources. I own it, and no one else gets to see it. No one else gets to do all these things we're talking about. Commercial just means I'm making money off it. So, right. So the good example of support or assurance is something like Red Hat. I can go get that kernel. I can distribute it. Right? There's nothing stopping me from doing so. But big companies that are on Linux may pay for Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Why? Because they know they're getting patches. They know it's supported. They know you know what we really like to be able to do in big business especially is blame. Right? Like if something goes wrong, you want to be able to point to someone. Right? Like I'm not a huge fan of the blame game generally, but you need to have, if something's not working, you have someone to go to, and you know that they're standing behind it. You have warranties, you have support, you have fixes and patches. The other thing is consulting, right? So you can sell consulting services around the thing that you're offering, and that's right. So here's the software, but I might be able to help you figure out how to integrate that into your systems. I might be able to help you customize it or use these tools to make something better, right? You can sell the services. The software itself is still open source and free, but people come to you because they know you have expertise. Bottom line is you kind of need to be able to plus it, right? You need to be able to say, I have this open source thing, but I can kind of give you a little bit more. But if you can do that, you can make a fortune with open source software. Questions about any of the topics? Any of the sort of what makes open source what it is? Yeah. Oh, yeah, that can be difficult, can't it, right? So software is a funny thing. I have a different talk. So the question is sort of like, basically the question is like, what recourse, right? Like, what do you do if something goes wrong? And that's a very difficult question to answer, right? So one of the things that you hear lawyers have certain words they like to use, that are words like maybe and it depends. Like we use those words a lot. It kind of goes along with the I'm not your lawyer bit, but it can be very difficult because so I have a whole other talk on just intellectual property at its core, right? About copyrights and trademarks and patents and trade secrets and those things. And one of the things about intellectual property is that it's intangible, right? It's like, it's easy to say you stole my Coke can. It's a lot harder to say you stole my thing. And it's much easier to abscond with it because it's just like ones and zeros, right? It's like up in the cloud. It's very easy to do that and misuse it, and it's hard to discover. So one thing, the truth of the matter is it can be very hard to discover, an infringement. I mean, do you even know? But if you do, the answer of like what court and where you sue, it really does depend, right? It depends on the situation, depends on the parties involved. Sometimes there may be more than one choice. Now, in multiple countries, it gets very hairy, right? Because while these open source licenses have sort of broad principles that apply everywhere and are kind of global, the individual laws about protecting or defending intellectual property may vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. It's not an easy question to answer, right? There is no, I'm not trying to evade it so much like there isn't a simple answer for that. And it is very hard unless you're, it's not necessarily so hard if you're Microsoft or Google or Facebook, right? But it can be very hard if you're a smaller company to defend these things. It's costly, it's time consuming, you need a lot of lawyer time and a lot of discovery, right? So the truth of all that, right, and I was having a good conversation yesterday about this, which is that the thing with the law is that it's supposed to be like, we have rules and it's rigid, but enforcing those rules can be a very, very difficult thing and it gets fuzzy. So realize again, like when we talk about this, it's more like these are the principles that we should be following, but oh, right. So and so that can sometimes depend on where things are being hosted and where they're being deployed from, right? So for example, it may be, are you hosting a project in GitHub, and does GitHub have rules about that and jurisdiction over things that are hosted there? Or are you deploying this from your own server in your own company? Is the jurisdiction, if you're releasing software, but you're a huge American corporation incorporated in Delaware, right? It may well be that you have other terms associated with your software, not in the license itself, but other terms that, like a EULA, that specifies like the jurisdiction. If there's any sort of claim, you might say, oh, we're going to have binding arbitration, or it's going to be in the courts of the state of Delaware. That might be through other documents associated with the software that you distribute. So it still kind of depends, unfortunately. All right, that's a good question though. Anything else? All right, licenses. So we've talked about sort of definition. Like now we understand what it even means to be open source. We want to look at a handful of the most commonly used licenses. There's a lot of them. There's a lot of open source licenses. They're kind of all governed by, I mentioned briefly earlier, like the OSI, the Open Source Initiative. So the Open Source Initiative is like this sort of nonprofit. People familiar with them? Anyone seen the symbol before? Right, where their job is basically to be the stewards of the open source definition, for one thing, which is sort of that whole sort of living document of this is what it means to be open source, the free redistribution, the derivative works, all that stuff. They also review licenses. Right, so yeah, there's a family of approved open source licenses, but if someone writes something new and says, I want to change, I don't like any of the licenses out there, but I want open source and I've drafted this other thing, but I want it to be a recognized proper open source license, these are the guys who review it to make sure that the terms of the license you provided comply with the requirements of what it means to be open source in the first place. Now, they have a whole lot of open source licenses they support, right, and they fall basically in two broad categories. Right, this is oversimplification. But there are permissive licenses, and there are copyleft licenses. Anyone ever heard the term copyleft? Yeah, a few people, cool. And we're gonna talk about that in a little bit when we get to like the GPL. Permissive is sort of like a catch-all term. Like to me, permissive, I always feel like permissive means it's not copyleft, right, in a lot of respects. But permissive are in a lot of ways like less restrictive licenses that actually allow more rights to the end consumer, and copyleft licenses, which we'll talk about with the GPL are licenses that put more restrictions on how you can redistribute. You can do all these things that are open source, but there are limitations on the way you can do it. And copyleft is really sort of a mechanism to ensure that open source software that is once open source remains always open source. And we'll talk about a little more about what that means shortly. But we're going to talk about 4 main licenses: the MIT, the BSD, Apache 2, and then sort of the family of GPL licenses. There's a whole bunch of others, but those 4 categories of licenses cover something like 80 or 90% of all projects on GitHub. Like right, the vast majority fall into one of those. And we're going to kind of start on a spectrum that goes from most permissive to most copyleft. Right? The MIT license, anyone familiar with the MIT license? Yeah? The MIT license is very popular with developers. People really like it a lot. Because, please don't read this. I mean, you can if you like, but because that's it. And that may look like a lot of words, but like, trust me, as a lawyer, in a legal document, that is not very many words, right? That's a short thing. And it really only has a few components to it. The MIT license is broadly permissive and has very few restrictions on what you can or can't do. The entire first paragraph here is basically a non-exclusive enumeration of all of the things that you can do with this software that you're receiving under the MIT license. And then the second one is basically about attribution, and the third one is about as is. So attribution, basically meaning, hey, if you're going to use this thing, make sure that you still include the copyright notices. When you redistribute my thing, you still need to make sure that the copyright notices from me are still in it, that this license is still distributed with your software. Right? Give attribution to the people who own it. Because again, remember, this is a license, not a transfer, not a sale. I wrote the software. I have the copyright. I still own it. I'm giving you a license to use it. Please don't abscond or misappropriate somebody else's identity, and please don't fail to give attribution to the people who actually wrote the software that you're using. So that's the first thing. All open source licenses will have that. And the second thing, going back, the big chunk at the bottom, here's another thing about lawyers. When we really want you to pay attention, we put it in all caps. We shout at you. I hate that because I think that's actually really hard to read. I think it's a game where we act like we're making it really obvious, but really what's happening is we want it to be harder to read because I think it's harder to read all caps, at least for me. But they want to have your attention. And this is a disclaimer of warranty. Okay, so all that whole huge paragraph is saying is this software is given to you as is. There's no warranty, there's no guarantees, there's no promises about what it'll do. You're taking it as is and just assuming the risk. Sounds kind of draconian, but that's what most of these licenses will say. But that's it. Like, that's MIT. It's a really short, really simple license to use. Many developers, it's their favorite license. It is not my favorite license, but we will talk about why in a couple minutes. The BSD license is also out of academia, right? It's the Berkeley software distribution, right? It came from Cal Berkeley. It's nearly as old. In fact, it might actually be older than the MIT license. And the BSD license is also very permissive. It's very similar to the MIT. It has all the same things, but when you see something with the BSD, you need to be careful because there are at least 3 different versions of the BSD that are like out in the wild in common use. And the easiest way to remember them, they have a bunch of different names, but the easiest way to remember is there's like the 2 clause, the 3 clause, or the 4 clause. Right? How many paragraphs are there of like numbered stuff in this license? The 2 clause, which you don't see very often, basically is MIT. All the things MIT says, the 2 clause BSD has the same stuff. You have attribution, and this thing is as-is software with no warranty. The 3 clause, which is the most common, has what's called the non-endorsement provision. The non-endorsement provision says that in taking this software, when you use it in your own promotional or marketing materials about the thing that you produce, right? You create some big derivative work, some big piece of proprietary software, but you used my open source library to do it. You cannot, it kind of goes, it's very similar to the idea of like the trademark idea, right? You cannot use the original author's name or identity in any way that makes it appear as though your software is endorsed by this other author, right? It's basically, you can't say, I built it with this thing, so you know it's good. Or you know that they stand behind me because I built it with their tool. Can't do that. And the reason is that's protecting the upstream author, right? They may have written a great library, and your software may be garbage, right? It may be amazing, but it may be garbage. What you don't want is the reputation of the open source author to be tarnished by some idea making it look like, hey, I built this software, and it uses this thing, and now people start thinking, well, maybe that thing is no good because I don't like this software. So you're not allowed to make it appear as though the open source author endorses you. Now, the fourth clause, if you see the fourth clause BSD, which you don't see often either anymore, but you still see it, has a very similar sounding provision with a very different impact. There's an advertising clause that says, yeah, you can't pretend like there's endorsement, but when you distribute this thing in those same materials, promoting and marketing your stuff, you need to make sure in any advertising provision or any advertising materials that you give proper attribution in all those materials of all the people who've contributed to make this software possible. That sounds really nice and warm and fuzzy, right? Giving credit where credit's due. That's cool unless the library has been out in the wild for a very long time and has hundreds of contributors, and next thing you know, you're buying like a $10,000 full-page ad in MSDN magazine, and it's just basically a list of names, right? Becomes very onerous. You don't see it much because once people start realizing the implications, they were afraid to use it. But you still see it. You got to watch for it. That's only in the 4-clause BSD, but if you see that advertising provision, be wary. If you're never going to advertise like the software you're building, maybe you don't care. But if you're using it to build like a big commercial product in the enterprise space, or you think you ever might do that, it could be problematic. All right. Those things all make sense, right? So those are permissible. Yeah, question. Oh, well, that's a good question. Is the list what? The list of sort of contributors? Well, I mean, it's at the time of the thing that you, right. So if I take in and I use your open source library, all right, and or I'm consuming something, it's that at that point in time, who contributed to the software I'm using in the distribution that I've now made. If later on 20 more people contribute or 100 more people contribute, but I never merge that down into my code base, not a problem. On the other hand, if I do, right, if I do over time, I make a new release, but I pull the new version of that library or tool in, then I probably have to update the list. Oh, well, if it's properly tracked, you ought to, in a perfect world, you ought to be able to find it by going back to the source of truth, the repository in some fashion, right? But you ought to be able to track the history and see who's contributed. Because theoretically, right, we're giving attribution to everyone who contributes. So in theory, someone's contributions or authorship should never disappear from the record, in theory, right? In theory, you should always be giving attribution to the people before you who built the stuff that you're building on top of. That's what you're supposed to do. I mean, if people aren't following the rules, yeah, it can be very hard. All right. So these two are the most permissive licenses, but here's the thing. They came out of academia at a time when almost all computing was happening in academia, right? Something started happening over the last 15 to 20 years in the software industry globally, and particularly in the United States. I've mentioned I have a soapbox about it, and that is, yeah, software patents and trolling. Became like a massive problem. Because all of a sudden, people started realizing that, oh God, the United States is actually letting us patent these things, and other countries are doing the same, and we can make lots and lots of money doing that. Maybe I'll just sit on them and acquire patents and then sue people. That's great, right? So here's the thing about open source software is those first two had nothing at all to do with patents. Nothing. Those were copyright licenses. I'm giving you a right to use my copyrighted material. If it turns out that some of that material is patented or patentable, I have given you no license or right to use the patented thing. So we lawyers freak out about that, right? That's potentially problematic in a world where software patents are a thing, no matter how we may feel about that. Right? My feelings about it don't matter because the law is still the law, right? And so the Apache Foundation took what was a very MIT BSD type license and what was the Apache version 1.1 license and released Apache 2. Apache 2 is not a short, easy to read document. It's a contract with numbered provisions and a set of definitions and all these things. It reads like a contract. On the other hand, it does a few really, really important things. First of all, and most importantly, it grants a patent license. So it says, not only am I giving you a license to my copyrighted work, I'm also giving you a license to anything that is patented or patentable or may become patented in this piece of software. That's awfully helpful. It also has what's called a non-assert clause, a patent non-assert clause, which is sometimes kind of affectionately referred to as a poison pill type philosophy in the law, which says, not only am I giving you a patent license, and I promise not to assert a patent claim against you, But if you ever turn around and assert patent claims against other contributors and try to come back and troll the same thing and assert patent rights or initiate patent litigation on this project, your license terminates instantly without notice. So you have the right to do this thing and use it, and we're being nice to you, but if you decide not to be nice to us, you don't get to use it anymore. Now, I think that's great, actually, because I think we live in too litigious of a society. So I think that's wonderful. But compare and contrast this really quickly to, who's familiar with what happened like the React license with Facebook kind of last year? Did anyone follow that news? Familiar with it? Some people, right? So there was a whole big fuss about the React license where people were saying, like, I was telling people not to use React. Because what Facebook did is they did something very similar that felt the same, but they didn't use the Apache license. They were licensing React under the BSD license, which seemed really nice, and then had a separate like patents.txt file that said, and we promise not to sue you over any patents. But they had a poison pill that was a little different. It said, if you ever sue us for anything at all, not just for this thing, not just for intellectual property rights, like if you decide to, if we infringe on your things, you decide to sue us to defend your rights. If you initiate litigation against Facebook, we take your license to use React and every other Facebook tool away. Yeah, that's very different. So don't confuse that broad overreach with this somewhat narrow carve out of like the Apache poison pill, which says, we're giving you this thing, and if you try to screw me on this thing, you can't play with my toy anymore. Right? This is narrowly defined. The Facebook thing was fixed with React 16, I think, not because they felt bad about it, and not because they agreed, because they kept insisting they weren't going to change it. But then the Apache Foundation told people to stop using React. And Facebook said, well, maybe we care, but not really. And then WordPress said, we aren't going to support React anymore. We're going to pull it all out. And since WordPress owns like 98.3% of the internet, all of a sudden, it's not really that much, but it feels like it. Facebook fixed the problem. But it took an awful large hammer for them to care, because Facebook. Okay. The other thing the Apache license does is they define derivative works very specifically. A derivative work is the thing that you actually modify. If you actually change original source code files, or if you create something new with some of the source code files. But if you can separate out and have a part of an Apache licensed software product or a tool set, and you can have separately identifiable components that you don't modify at all, that are pristine, right, that are only dynamically linked to your software, that pristine thing is actually not a derivative work. It's the original work. And interestingly enough, that original work has to be redistributed with the original Apache license it came with. But your derivative works that you create can be released under a different scheme or under a different license. And you have to like keep detailed change logs. One of the other things that is required under Apache. So lastly, GPL. Free as in freedom or something. Yeah, right. Like, yay, it's free. Like really assertively, aggressively free. You will be free, is right, whether you like it or not. That is really at the heart of what GPL is. I say that like it's a bad thing, and it's not in some circumstances. In other circumstances, it can be very difficult. Like in an enterprise situation, it can be very hard. So the GPL family of licenses are copyleft, right? And again, the idea here is once free, always free. You get something under a GPL license, and there's several versions, but they all have the same general theme, which is you got this thing, and now anything you produce with it will also be open source and free. Right? That's not true to say the MIT license these others. Like I can take an MIT licensed open source component, put it in my software, and make something not only monetized and commercial, but proprietary. I can take an MIT component and redistribute something under a closed commercial license that is not open source. You can't do that here. Copyleft prevents that. So you use the copyleft licensed tool. That's fine as long as you don't mind that the thing that you're building with it is also going to be an open source piece of software, whether you like it or not. So really, people talk about like the free as in freedom, and it is the most open, but realize that most open also does mean most restrictive in terms of what you can or cannot do with the software. There are several versions, and I haven't really done this with the other licenses because they're similar enough, I guess the BSD a bit. But the GPL, there are distinct differences. So the four most common is, even though you would think, well, there's version 3, like with the Apache, you don't see Apache 1.1 anymore, you see Apache 2. You actually see GPL 2 in the wild a lot, and it is dramatically different from GPL 3. GPL3 has all the patent stuff and the patent non-assert poison pill stuff. GPL2 doesn't have any of the patent language in it at all. GPL3 was built to be much more compatible with other licenses. GPL2 is sometimes tougher to work with. LGPL is like a soft copyleft license. Have you ever heard of LGPL or seen it before? It's right. It's sometimes I think it's officially like the lesser general public license, although many people call it like the library GPL. And I think the reason they do that is because the idea is if you have a GPL library that's under LGPL, and again, all you do is dynamically link. You don't inextricably combine it with your own code. You don't statically link it to your own code if that's still a thing, right? But it's just simply a dynamic reference to some library. You're okay. Like the library's on its own and has to be redistributed under LGPL, but the thing you built that only links to it, you aren't stuck with the sort of the infecting of your entire solution with GPL copyleft requirements if it's LGPL. That's not true with all these others, right? With all these others, even if you just dynamically link the thing, now everything, it's all open, right? It's all being distributed under GPL compatible licenses. But LGPL gives you a way around that. AGPL is the exact opposite. AGPL, remember earlier, a little while back, we talked about sort of software as a service, right? And what is distribution? And if the code is just executing as like a remote process on your server, like an API, and they call it, and you're not, then you haven't distributed software, so you're fine. Yeah, AGPL says no, not here. AGPL, which is like the Affero GPL, is intentionally closing that loophole. So if you're using something that is AGPL licensed, even if you're only executing on a remote server and you're not actually distributing it to anybody, it is still covered by GPL. And the very fact of having it executing on your server requires that if somebody requests it, they get the source code and they get all the stuff, and it's a copyleft open source license that has to be distributed under a GPL compatible license. Very restrictive. That's great if you're truly building like open source and you want it to be open all the time because free isn't freedom. And if you have side projects where that's how you feel about it, that's totally fine and totally great. And if you are building proprietary software in an enterprise place where you report up to 3, 5, 10 chains of command of people who are deciding how this software works, and you have to worry about like protecting your intellectual property, that's pretty bad. Like that's a problem. So depends on how you're using your software. Another thing is GPL compatibility, which is sort of a weird concept. Okay, GPL compatibility asks what, on its face, seems like a simple enough question, which is, can code under license whatever be combined and redistributed with code covered by GPL? What that means is that I'm building software. Not only does GPL make something copyleft, but part of copyleft is that if I'm going to redistribute this thing, I can't make my software any less open than it was when you gave it to me. You gave me this thing that is GPL, and now I'm building something with it, and the thing, my derivative work, can't become less open. So if I pull in some other component that is licensed to me under some other license, do the terms of that license add any restrictions or do anything that change the openness, the freedom of the end result? If so, I can't even do it. I can't even use those two libraries on the same product. I would be violating the GPL simply by also using that other component, which is not GPL compatible. Right? Like they mean it when they say freeze and freedom. They're not kidding. So examples of that. Take the Apache license. GPL2 didn't have the patent stuff. So Apache adds a patent rights. That's great. GPL's happy. Good. You made it even better because you gave someone a patent license. Oh, but you also said that they do something bad and sue you, you'll take it away. Oh, that's bad. No, you took away some rights. No, you can't mix those two things. So I'm using something that's GPL2. I can't even use an Apache library or tool with it. I cannot put the same, they do not mix. They're like oil and water, and I cannot use the GPL thing. I can't use the GPL2 thing. I'd be violating the GPL2 license. Same deal with the old BSD, which is the 4-clause one that had the advertising provision. All GPLs do not have that. So by telling someone you're using a GPL library and you also want to use this BSD thing that says you have to have all the advertising stuff, you're adding more restrictions. You're making them, no, that's no good. We can't have you do that. Sorry, you can't use the two together. That's what GPL compatibility is all about. So just by virtue of using GPL and something else, you might right away be violating GPL. Be aware of that. Remember, yeah. Right, so that's a good question, right? It's a really good question. The question was, Does it matter if you're redistributing the thing versus like, I just want to use these things for my own purpose? Well, right, the issue about copyleft is when you redistribute software, you have to do it under these conditions. So yeah, if you're really never going to redistribute the thing, do whatever you want. But you better be really sure, right? If you change your mind later and say, I really like this thing, I think I want to throw it up on GitHub, like you have to purge all the stuff that's not compatible, right? But if you're really just doing something to play around or experiment or a sandbox and do something that's just for you, that's never being distributed like anywhere, like not to your friends, not to show like your mom, right? Like if you're distributing outside the walls of like your business, within an organization, within the four walls, so to speak, of a company, to employees of the company, that's not considered distribution, by the way, right? But distributing to a contractor who's a 1099 who just does work with your company, now you've distributed something. So, because the idea is the employer actually owns the environment and all the computers and laptops that they're working on, so you haven't distributed to a new environment, and so the requirements aren't triggered. But yeah, if it's only for your own internal use, fine. All right, so the other thing to remember about this compatibility issue is just because something's compatible doesn't mean that it's not copyleft. So let's say that I've got GPL and I have Apache 2 and GPL 3 and MIT, for example. Those things are all compatible. But just because they're compatible, I can mix them together and have a result, but the result can't go out under Apache or under MIT. The result, it is still a copyleft license, and the result is it's going to go out under GPL. Yeah, you can use those things, but when you hand it out, it's still going to be a GPL license. So compatibility is not the same as like the copyleft requirement, which is just intrinsic to what GPL and copyleft is. Question about any of the GPL stuff or any of the licenses? All right, cool. So key considerations. So now it's like, all right, we've talked about some of the major licenses. We kind of know what's going on open source. Like, so what? So what? How does that impact me every day? Like, why do I care? At the beginning, right, I was like, why do we care about this? Well, what do I have to be thinking about? Hopefully, you're already starting to get some ideas of things that matter that you need to be like, well, I should really check that. Or hopefully, no one's like, man, I think I just brought that GPL thing in like 2 days ago. Right. But what do you need to think about the enterprise? It's more than just what the licenses are. There's a lot of things to think about. One of the key like tenets of open source as a community is the idea of contribution, right? It's the aggregate. The community comes together and we build something. One of the reasons we have open source, right, is we leverage the brain power of like all these brilliant people and we all work together on this thing to make it better. So that's not necessarily exactly what makes open source, right? Just because something's open source, it is not required that I accept pull requests. I don't have to do that. I can't stop you from forking it and releasing it on your own or some other distribution. I don't have to take your contribution. But what if you want to? What if you want to accept contributions? What if you want to push something back in, right? What if you got some open source library for your thing that you're building for your company? You say, you know, I fixed this thing, I like it. I think I'd like to just submit a pull request and push it back up to make the tool better upstream. Well, a couple things you have to think about, right? There are CLAs. Anyone ever had to sign or agree to a CLA or a CAA? Right? They sound like they're almost exactly the same thing. They're totally not. They're similar, but they're not the same. They're contribution license agreements and contribution assignment agreements. Many larger repositories will allow you to submit changes or submit pull requests and try to make contributions. But in doing so, you are required to agree to one of these things. The key difference, that middle letter, license, is just like an open source license. I wrote this thing. I would like to contribute it back to your project, but I still own it. And just like you've licensed me your library, I'm licensing you my work to incorporate it back into your library. Assignment is like a fancy lawyer word for transfer. Right? Like strictly speaking, like when you buy a house, the deed that you take is like an assignment of property. Right? So assignment is, I don't own it anymore. I made a contribution and I'm giving it to you. I give it to the project to do as you please, and I am no longer the copyright holder of it at all. I have transferred my rights in full back to the project. Big difference. Because again, if you're in the enterprise world and you want to make contributions back, you still probably want to be sure that you're protecting the intellectual property that you have produced, and your company might not be crazy about assigning any rights of anything that its employees develop to give back to some other project in an irrevocable sort of way. So, and same goes for if you're accepting these things, right? If you accept requests from people and you want to open source a component, like, do you want to accept pull requests? And if so, you want to make sure you have one of these things when you accept the other people's contributions. Oh, surprise. Surprise liability is a fun thing in the law. Surprise liability is sort of like, is sort of like similar to strict liability with products. It's kind of, I just going about minding my own business. Did I find myself suddenly surprised liable for something that I didn't even know was a thing, and now somebody can legitimately sue me for something? That's a major concern and fear of a lot of big companies when we talk about open source software. Because like we're going to use this thing and distribute it, but like is somebody going to come back and sue us because we're using some like take AutoMapper, right? Like Jimmy Bogart, who's here, who's speaking, who like he wrote an amazing tool, but like he's a dude, right? Like he's one guy, and I use his tool and some software. If something goes wrong, is someone going to try to sue me instead? Because like my company has the deep pockets and Jimmy's just like some guy. But the good news is, so companies get really worried about this. But remember, the good news is, what were the all caps? Like even on the MIT license, right? When it was shouting at you, as is. Those are special magical words, right? Now, it doesn't mean someone won't sue you, because we sue people. I mean, but you should be protected in most circumstances, right? Because you've disclaimed any warranty. So you're probably okay. What about that GPL risk? Is it bad? Is GPL bad? No. Is GPL3 or AGPL bad when you're writing like some sort of special proprietary software that's super secretive that's going to make your company billions of dollars and you don't want to open source? Yeah. Right? So be aware of that more than any other license. It doesn't mean don't use it. It means be aware of your use and what you're going to be doing and plan ahead, right? It's the, what if I'm not distributing it? What, are you sure? Are you sure you're not distributing it? Right? Think about that, and that impacts how you think about the risk of copyleft and GPL licenses. What if there is no license? Right. What if it's just not there? I have something I'm playing around right now because I was doing some stuff with ASP.NET Core recently, and I'm like an astronomy nerd. And so like I've been building this little like astronomy observation app, and I decided I want it up in GitHub, really more for me, so I have like a point of truth in case anything happens. It's up in GitHub. Source code's there. It's fine. I haven't put a license on the repo. It's just up there. Right? But you can see it. You can go find it. Go find me on GitHub and pull it down. It's not great, so I wouldn't recommend it yet. But it's up there. If there's no license file, it's not licensed. Absence of a license doesn't mean do as you please. Absence of a license means you can't have it. That's an important thing to remember always with intellectual property. Putting it on the internet does not mean that you can have it. Finding it on Google doesn't mean it's yours. Right? So me putting on GitHub should not be, that does not create a presumption that I'm licensing you to use the software. Unless there's a license in the repo that says you can use the software, I still own it. I still wrote it, and you can't have it. Absence of a license does not give you all the rights. It gives you none of the rights. Okay. Yeah. Right. Stack Overflow is a kind of an interesting case because Stack Overflow, like when you agree to contribute, like to become a member and actually start making contributions, posting code, there are licenses and things that are part of the terms of service. So when you post things onto Stack Overflow, I don't know, there's like an OSI license. I think it might be Creative Commons or something like this. But there are licenses with the stuff that you provide on Stack Overflow. So in that particular case, you're largely okay. But on the other hand, we do joke about like, oh, I don't know how to solve this problem, but I found it on the internet. I looked on Google and I found some guy's blog. Now that's different. That's different, right? Stack Overflow is a platform that provides licenses out of the box. That's part of the platform. That's part of why it works. Stack Exchange in general, that's part of why it works. You find a piece of code on like John Papa's blog, and he doesn't provide some sort of catch-all license or something about that post that says you can use this. Strictly speaking, now is John Papa or is Microsoft going to sue you? No, probably not. But strictly speaking, yeah, there's no license. Like he's just sharing information. Like Control-C, Control-V off that blog post is probably infringement. Yeah, it's protected by copyright. You publish the thing, you have copyright, like as a matter of law, if you're the genuine author, right? So yeah, so Stack Overflow is generally safe only because they've made it so, right? There's another consideration is what about just sort of I want to use open source stuff, but go back to Jimmy, right? He's great, he's smart, he writes good software, he means well. He's also the chief architect at Headspring, and he's busy. Or he may get bored. He may just not have time to screw with AutoMapper, right? If you're using an open source library, it goes back kind of the idea of like the Red Hat Enterprise Linux, or like who's supporting and backing this thing? It's not, if there's a security, like there's a hole, is it being patched? Is someone backing it up? Maybe, but maybe not. Do you know who's supporting the software? Do you know that it's active? Right? Do you know that like you're using a library, but there hasn't been a commit in 6 years on it? Like, is anyone paying attention? Right? So you got to know, like, is this thing secure? Is it safe to use? Is it going to be getting better over time? Or similarly, like, is it dead? Or what if it dies? Right? Like straight up, more often than not, when a software project dies, it doesn't go away. Right? Especially with like the advent of things like GitHub. It just stays inactive and it's there. Right? You'll do a search, and if the right description is in the README file, like on the repo, you're probably just going to find it. And no one's touching it, and it's been lost, and it's full of cobwebs that you can't see those cobwebs. Right? Because it's like an intangible thing, so you don't know. So if it suddenly dies, or if you're using it and then one day it does die, are you going to know? Are you going to keep track? Are you going to make sure you know that if this thing stops being supported, you have an out? Are you prepared to say, you know what? This thing died, but it's important to my organization. We will take the reins, and we will support this library because it matters to us. That's an option. Yeah. Does the license still apply if it dies? Yeah, it does, because the license, again, is kind of about, much like the advertising question earlier, it's a point in time, right? So the license is like today, right, May, whatever today is, 10th, 2018, is that right? Okay. You download software. At the time you downloaded it, it was available and it came with this license. That's a thing, like that gave you perpetual rights. Short of some provision that terminated those, like the patent poison pill stuff, like that was a distribution. Tomorrow, I may kill the repo. Tomorrow, I may take it offline. Tomorrow, I may push a major new release, a major new version. That doesn't matter. That's a separate distribution. The one you are using was licensed to you today under a specific license with a specific set of code. That survives. If I want to pull the thing down, because remember, free redistribution, if I decide to kill it, but you like it, so you host it. I can't stop you from doing that. It's open source software. You can freely redistribute it. If I decide that I'm not going to distribute it anymore, right, that's one of the difficulties and the dangers, right? With like the GPL risk is not just like the copyleft thing, you can fix that. But if you figure it out and fix it after the fact, after you've already screwed it up, right? After you've already made a distribution and violated the GPL, like it's out there. Like you can't put that Pandora back, like you can't close that box, right? Like you put it out there and yeah, you can fix it now, but there are people who've already taken that distribution that's already in violation of the license that you've already put out. So it's all about like a moment in time, right? Right now, you're receiving a distribution of software, and what are the rights and limitations that you have at that moment when you receive it? Does that answer your question? Okay. Forgot that was still on the board. Okay. Here's another one related to your question earlier about like and when I kind of was on like what's the strategy. It's not just about the GPL thing. It's I had a client several years ago who was a startup that was building like a photo sharing, photo streaming kind of thing, a Flickr, Picasa type, similar type service. They had some unique, novel things about it that made it special. But there's a startup Silicon Valley thing. Successful serial entrepreneur. This guy and his wife were both like MBAs from Harvard, and they're in their early 30s and successfully sold like several companies for many, many millions of dollars. So we're like, yeah, you can probably pull this thing off. It seems cool. And then one day he called us and said, hey, I didn't know this was going to happen, but Shutterfly called and they want to buy it. It's like, oh, that's cool. And then Shutterfly's lawyers called us, the consulting firm, to ask specifically about all of the open source that may have been used in developing this tool that we built for them. Because Shutterfly was bigger and they cared and they needed to protect their intellectual property rights. So you may have things that you don't worry about or care about today, but like, where are you going with this piece? Now, it turned out they were okay because we were diligent and we kept track of these things. Right? But what are you going to do with the software you're writing today? No one knows the future, but you can try to plan and have an idea. Like, where might I go with this thing? How might I want to see the future of this software product or package go? And what are the implications then on what I do or don't use based upon my plans or my goals or my dreams? Right? So all of that means a couple of things. Most notably, it kind of feels scary, right? It sounds like I'm saying this is terrible and dangerous and don't use GPL and oh my God, open source, like, oh, we're all going to die. We're not, right? Like we're not. We have, as I said at the very beginning, we have to use open source software. You have to use it. You have to use it. We all use it. Like there's no way you're writing software today without using it. If you are, right, then you're wasting tons of time and you're wasting tons of money and you're probably reinventing the wheel. I have a client right now who shall remain nameless to protect the innocent, but I have a client right now who they've come to us to try to modernize their stack, but they built these services and they rolled their own identity management and they rolled their own model validation for stuff, and they were like they right because they I don't know, I don't even know why, right? But they wasted a lot of time and money rebuilding things that are already out there, some of which is open source. Like, stand on the backs of giants, right? Like, do the thing and use the tools that people have already solved these problems, right? These problems have been solved. That's great, but you need to make sure that you get teamwork to avoid the risks, to plan for what you do, right? There are very simple ways to do this. There are a lot of tools out there, like Black Duck software, things like that. There are companies out there that will help. Sometimes they're heavy-handed. Has anyone ever used Black Duck? Anything? Okay. So Black Duck software is sort of a tool that kind of helps audit and keep track of like your open source package of the components that you have. That's really nice. It's really helpful. It's good software. And I'm not saying don't use it. I think it depends on the scale of what you're doing. In huge enterprise places where you don't really care what you spend, for starters, and you really have major concerns, it's really fantastic. It can protect you quite a bit. They do tend to be alarmist, in my opinion. They tend to be a little bit fear-mongery because then you feel even more like you need their software, right? But there are simple things you can do on smaller projects or smaller teams, like thumbs up, thumbs down. Right? This is a very simple thing that can solve like 80% of your problems. Because the biggest deal like in software is you got a team of people trying to write software and they've got a problem, and the thing that they're trying to fix right now was supposed to be fixed like 8 days ago. They found out about it 4 days ago, and they're trying to get it done now. And everyone on the team's like, you're blocking us, and we got to get this done. And so like, what do? We go on Google, we find something on Stack Overflow, we find a thing in GitHub, and we go, I got to get it done. Check the box. Yeah, sure, I agree. Your license, sure. Right? So having conversations and just doing something as simple as saying, hey, for our organization, here's why it matters. And if you see these licenses, we as an organization have agreed we're comfortable with the risks and we want to use these things. If you see these licenses, like, I'm sorry, it doesn't matter how good it is, no way, if it's really that important to you, come talk to us, we'll have a conversation, but probably no. And if there's something in the middle where you're not sure, but it seems like a great thing, then we can have the dialogue and discuss whether this particular licensing scheme is okay. That simple, like, not even a tool, right? Like communication, talking to each other, right? That simple act can solve so many problems because you empower developers to make better decisions, to understand why it matters, and to care long enough to at least say, I wonder which license it is I'm about to check the box on. Oh, it's MIT? Okay. Oh, it's GPL. Oh, yeah, they said I can't use that. And maybe I'll look at the second thing in Google, right? The idea is whatever it is, whatever your organization is, it's just putting the right tools and process in place. It does not have to be complicated. It just has to be empowering. Now, if you do that and you get everyone on board, then like you're less likely to have a major issue. So what do I want you to take away from this is just basically a few things, right? Have a plan. As simple as that. Like, I don't want to make you all lawyers. Please, please don't become lawyers, right? I don't want you to do that. I don't want you to know all these answers. I want you to know that it matters and have a plan for why it matters and what you're going to do to try to mitigate your risks. Right? Include everyone on the team, right? The communication thing, right? Make sure everyone's on board and understands why as a team, as a collective. Never just lead from the top and dictate things down because then people won't care, right? And, and empower people. So, as all, again, there's my email address. Twitter is just @JeffreyStrauss. Jeffrey is 2 syllables, not 3, like R-E-Y. It's not Jeff-er-y. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions. If you think about things after the fact, you want to ask. I'm here for PubConf night. Go to PubConf. Like, it's awesome. Like, really, it is. Go to PubConf, and I'll be here till like midday tomorrow. So if you think of something, feel free to ask anytime. But then just reach out. If you use that hashtag, the OSS Impact hashtag, I'll see it. It'll be easier for me to keep track and answer questions. But I love dialogue about these things, so feel free to reach out. That's it. Thanks so much.